Olá, obrigada por terem vindo. Vamos então começar esta nossa conversa com Andrei. Espero que fiquem com muita curiosidade, para quem ainda não leu o livro, depois desta nossa conversa sobre o livro, sobre a situação na Ucrânia e sobre todas as outras coisas que forem surgindo, porque as conversas normalmente são assim, puxa-se uma coisa, depois puxa-se outra e de repente já estamos a falar de todo um universo que não estávamos à espera. I'm going to start in English now. Andrei, thank you very much for being here. It's a pleasure to have you here in Portugal. And I'm going to say a few words about you, if you don't mind. And, well, it's a very short presentation about you, because you have a very huge biography, you know, a lot of things that you've done, a lot of places that you've been, so I'm going to be very brief, okay?
Okay.
So, Andrei Kurkov is a Ukrainian writer with Russian origins, born in Soviet Leningrad in 1961, now St. Petersburg. His parents moved to Kyiv when he was a small child, so he grew up in Ukraine, started to write as a teenager, some jokes and some poems, as I recall, and he continued to write during the Soviet period, a very difficult time to start to write, I would imagine, because freedom of speech in Soviet Union, as you well know, was not very well seen. But his will prevailed, and today Andrei is one of the best-known modern Ukrainian writers in the world. Andrei is the author of 24 novels, many children books, and also he's a screenwriter. His books are translated in 42 languages. Death and the Penguin, The Big Fort Fuse, and Grey Bees are some of them. And Grey Bees is now available in Portuguese. And this book was first published in 2018, right?
Yeah.
In Ukraine. So, Andrei, I hope that I did not forget something very important.
There is nothing important except books.
I know that you had many hobbies, right, when you were growing up, and one of them was about cactuses?
Yes, I had a collection number 7 of cactuses in Kyiv as a child. And because of cacti, actually, I started studying foreign languages.
That's impressive.
Because my first foreign language was botanical Latin. When I found out that each cactus has a name, surname, and patronymic in Latin, I wanted to know the meanings of these words. And then from Latin, I went to Polish language, and from Polish to English. And now I do events in 6 languages. And
wow.
I forgot some languages, but I
Portuguese?
Still, never tried.
No.
Never tried.
It's hard. It's not easy, but it's a very beautiful language.
But I graduated from the School of Translators of the Japanese language.
Wow.
So I used to speak Japanese.
You used to?
Yes, many years ago.
Okay, maybe we will teach a few words when this event ends in Portuguese, so you can add that to your list. Yes. Andrei, in this book you write about the absurdity of war, of the small war, as sort of to say the war before February of this year, the war that was going on in Donbass since 2014. Did you ever imagine that something else could happen, like this huge war that we are seeing right now? Were you prepared in some way for this war?
I think nobody can be prepared for any kind of war. In fact, actually, this war, which is going on today, was started in 2014 with annexation of Crimea and with the beginning of the war in Donbass. And the war in Donbass was going on all this time. I mean, the front line was 430 kilometers long. And I mean, I remember thinking that this frozen war can last for maybe decades, because in Cyprus, you know, the northern Cyprus is still unrecognized as Turkish territory. And in northern Cyprus, you have a city, Famagusta, which was built for tourists and was never used. And it is blocked off with barbed wire. So, I mean, for me, the frozen conflict in Donbass was similar a bit in the perspective with the Cyprus crisis of 1970s. But I knew that something will happen because Putin was getting older. his plans were broken because, I mean, he wanted the world to recognize annexation of Crimea. This was the most important thing. The annexation was not recognized. So the Crimea and Russia was under sanctions. There would be no, and there are no investments into Crimea. So his promise to Crimean people to make Crimea a rich area for holidaymakers didn't work. And he wouldn't wait too long until new escalation. So I was expecting escalation in Donbass. I didn't expect actually the all-out war and shelling big cities with missiles. And when we were woken up with my wife at 5 o'clock in the morning on 24th of February by explosions outside the window in Kiev, I mean, I knew what was happening, but I couldn't accept it for I don't know, probably for a day or two. So I was like paralyzed. Because, I mean, this was like extraterrestrial attack in Kiev and Ukraine, because normal people would not use the war machinery of the Second World War and the same tactics and the attitude. I mean, killing civilians, bombing cities. So this was apocalyptical. So, I mean, I would never imagine this kind of war in 21st century.
But now it seems like this war was inevitable. Do you feel that?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that the hate of Putin towards Ukraine was growing very, very fast. And the narrative in Russia was turning from political hostilities to fascist narrative. Mm-hmm. Because, I mean, Ukrainians were accused of being fascists. Then he was saying 10 years ago that Ukrainians and Russians are two brotherly nations. Then 3 years ago, he started saying that Ukrainians and Russians are one nation. Mm-hmm. And before the war, he said that Ukrainians do not exist. Ukraine was invented by Lenin, and that Ukrainians, they are really Russians who don't know that they are Russians, so we have to
help them
by force to remind them, to force them to become Russians. And for that, you have to destroy identity, national mm-hmm. identity of Ukrainians, and every identity is actually is language, history and culture. In Ukraine, because Ukraine is a multicultural place with minorities, it is history and culture and mostly Ukrainian language, but like in my case, it can be Russian language, it can be Hungarian language because we have Hungarian minority, it can be Crimean Tatar language and mixed Crimean Ukrainian identity like many Crimean Tatars have. So the war against identity is the second actual level of this war.
Because he's continuing the work of Stalin of erasing different identities. He's doing that now with the mobilization in Russia that started 1 week ago or something like that. And he's mobilizing more people in the smaller
ethnic minorities which have tendency to separatism, who want to be independent also from Moscow. But also, I mean, 1,500 Crimean Tatars are mobilized and they will be sent to fight against Ukrainians, and Crimean Tatars are mostly pro-Ukrainian. So, I mean, this is unspeakable, actually.
Yes, but I think that Ukrainians have some ways of sending them help to teach them how to surrender. At least I hope that it will work.
Well, there was a complaint in Russia somewhere on a social network. A wife of a mobilized Russian wrote that Ukrainian government shared the telephone number for those who want to surrender, but this line is always busy.
But you think that this could be the last war because Ukraine has been fighting for its own freedom, for its own identity and statehood for centuries, and Russians keep on forcing their own power into Ukraine. Do you think that this could be the last war?
Well, I am a pathological optimist, but not to this level. I don't think, I mean, while Russia is there and Russia wants to be empire and doesn't want to give up the colonial appetite, I think they will recover, even if they lose and agree that they give away annexed territories. But the narrative, I mean, Russia was always a monarchy. So, I mean, the Russians like to have a Tsar. They are loyal to the Tsar, they love their Tsar. When they are unhappy with the Tsar, they kill this Tsar and love the next one. So, I mean, this collective mentality is very easy to turn into fascist society because, I mean, they gave up freedoms slowly in the last 20 years. They prefer stability to freedom. Ukrainians never had a royal family. Ukrainians never had a Tsar, except foreign Tsars. So Ukrainians, when they were independent until 1654, they were choosing a leader of the state who was called Hetman, and they were choosing the higher officers. And after this Hetman was elected, they would immediately try to replace him with somebody else. So, I mean, the individualist mentality of Ukrainians is probably basis also of the anarchy, because, I mean, Ukrainian state or Ukrainian independent territory in 17th century, it was a territory of organized anarchy. Because at the same time when there was a diplomatic service, and you can find correspondence between Turkish sultans and Ukrainian hetmans in the archives of Istanbul, but Ukrainians never made their own money, their coins, their silver. They were using Polish silver, Turkish gold, etc. But they had legal system, they had courts, and they had military administration. So it's very, I mean, they just created their own kind of society, and it was always anarchic, because, I mean, they were fighting with each other a lot. When they were not fighting against Poland or against Russia, they would fight between themselves, which never had positive effect on the development of Ukraine. But now this individual mentality is back. It was actually retained by the Western Ukraine, because Eastern Ukraine, Central Ukraine were in the end assimilated by Soviet Union and by Russian Empire partially, by using policy of Russification, imposing Russian language and forcing people to forget Ukrainian. So, I mean, that's why we have now, well, partially because of this, we have 40% of Russian speakers. I mean, like, to be a Russian speaker it doesn't mean to belong to Russian ethnic minority. It's a social phenomenon from the Soviet times, because Russian remains inter-ethnic language in Western Ukraine and Bessarabia, where many minorities live. So once Ukrainian replaces Russian as inter-ethnic language, there will be not 40 but 15% of Russian speakers left.
This is very curious that you are mentioning it, because one of the narratives of Vladimir Putin to start this war was the fact that he was saying that Russian speakers in Ukraine are being murdered. The genocide of Russian speakers in Ukraine. That was one of his reasons to go into Ukraine, to save all those people. And you are a Ukrainian writer, but your native, your first language
My mother tongue is Russian. Yes,
Russian.
I write in Russian. I publish my books in Russian in Ukraine with no problems. My books are translated into Ukrainian. And actually, I mean, I had no problems neither with system nor with laws as a Russian speaker. I mean, I speak Ukrainian fluently, and I learned Ukrainian actually in the Soviet time in Kyiv. But in my school, I had only one friend from Ukrainian-speaking family. Everybody else was from Russian-speaking families. And actually what happened in the beginning of the war, the first civilian victims of the war were Russian speakers of Mariupol, of Akhtirka, of Kharkiv and the Kharkiv region. So actually he came to save Russian speakers by killing Russian speakers. I mean, he doesn't talk anymore about Russian speakers in his last speeches, because, I mean, he probably understands that nobody believes
it's not working.
And it is, I mean, it was used as pretext. Now there is, I mean, pretexts are not important now, because we are in the 8th month of the war.
But it's very interesting. Did you change to Ukrainian? Do you speak more often Ukrainian right now, or you remain
with
more
my
or less
friends
the
who
same?
are Ukrainian speakers, I always speak Ukrainian. When I'm in Western Ukraine, I speak Ukrainian. When I come to a cafe, and according to the law now, in every cafe or restaurant, the clients are addressed first in Ukrainian language. If they respond in Russian, then the waiter or the they start speaking Russian to them. So actually, when I go to my favorite cafes on Yaroslavl Val in Kiev, and I'm asked in Ukrainian what kind of coffee I want, I answer in Ukrainian. I don't ask to be, it's not a problem for me. In this sense, I'm totally bilingual, and I like here in Ukrainian because, Ukrainian language became the weapon. The language covers territory. So, in this sense, Donbass, mostly Russian speaking. And because of this, it was listening to the Russian radio, watching Russian television, and getting news about Ukraine from Russian TV news. And the result is this war. I don't want to simplify. I could talk more about this issue because there is a huge guilt of Ukrainian governments and politicians who never thought of integrating different regions into one society. Ukraine is 26 regions. Some of them, they are like separate countries if you talk about the traditions, mentality, rituals, history. But the people were tolerant always. And there were no problems because of the language or because of the Donbass origin or Zakarpattia origin, etc. But Ukrainian politicians could be effective if they wanted, but they had different interests.
Because they also, some of them were controlled by Russia.
Well, some of them were controlled by Russians, but actually mainly because they didn't think about the future of Ukraine. They were reacting to what was happening. And at the same time, they wanted to be rich. So, they were corrupt, and also corrupt by Russia, but corrupt inside the country. So they were more into money than into the state.
In this book, Grey Bees, Abelhas, Cinzentas in Portuguese, we have a story of Sergej, a man that was caught up in the middle of the war. He and Pashka, another character, are the two only people remaining in a very small village in a grey zone in Donbass. Grey zone is not from one side, not from the other. It's a place that exists on its own, and it's not controlled by any of the sides. So it's very hard to understand it. Why did you decide to write a story that has that point of view?
Well, because I met a young businessman in Kiev who fled from Donetsk. He was a shop owner in Donetsk, and then he came as many refugees, internally displaced persons, to Kiev. And first we had actually influx of rich Donetsk people who already had houses and flats in Kiev because it was fashionable to invest into property. Either in Crimea, in Odessa, or in Kiev. And then we had poor people coming. But when the rich came, I noticed it by accident. I was driving car, and suddenly I noticed that I'm driving car in Kiev, and I have in front of me two luxury cars with Donetsk number plate, and on the left and right also Donbass cars with number plates from that region. And they were driving like at home. They were thinking that the more expensive car you have, the less you abide the rules. So everybody should give you way. But then 3 months later, actually, they were driving already as anybody else. But then we had actually influx of cheap cars from Donbass with Donbass number plates, Moskvich, Zhiguli, etc. And I started meeting more often the people from Donetsk in the companies of my friend. And once actually I met this young man who said that he is driving every month to a village in near front line where there is no electricity, no shops, no police, no authorities, but 7 families remain there, and they're growing potatoes, just like ordinary peasants. And he was delivering them medicine and whatever they asked for. And I realized actually that he was talking about Grey Zone. And at that time, there were already about 200 books about the war in Ukraine published. Mostly non-fiction, but also fiction. And all these books were about fighting. Soldiers, enemies, tanks, cannons, artillery, etc. So there was nothing about civilians caught in the war, nothing about war crimes also. And so I thought, well, I should think about this, and I checked the war map, and I realized that length of the Grey Zone is the same as the length of the front line. It was 430 kilometers long. And so in this gray zone there were dozens of villages and part of town called Avdiivka in Donbass. And I traveled after the beginning of the war. I went 3 times to Donbass, to the war zone. And the first time I went almost all front line along to Severodonetsk, to the border with Russia. And I was trying to talk to locals, but most actually I was speaking to military, to the soldiers, officers, but some locals also were happy to talk, not many. And then I started actually checking on how many people can live in this gray zone. And it was like between 5,000 and 12,000 people who remained. And I talked to a lady who organized NGO in Kharkiv, and they were printing newspaper for the gray zone because they were cut off of information. There was no electricity, it means no internet, no TV, no radio. And in this newspaper, they were not publishing news from the front, no politics, only about pension fund news, sort of neutral, useful information, how to apply for social help. And there were volunteers who were bringing some medical supplies and other things to these villages, and it was always risky. Many were killed. And they were taking the newspaper with them to give to these people who remained there. And the archive of this newspaper is to be found in internet.
Wow.
So you can find and see what kind of information was sent to these people. And I decided just to give voice to these abandoned and forgotten people who just wanted to survive, who didn't show that they are pro-Russian or pro-Ukrainian because they were afraid of people from both sides. And actually the volunteers sometimes mentioned that the locals, these people of Grey Zone, they would meet them with a very dubious smile. So it was like they were afraid of everybody, of course. And there were also volunteers from separatist sides who were trying to come and to bring something. So I mean, the people who live there, they never knew from which side the person comes with the help.
So they had to just be neutral all the time.
Yeah, they had to show that they are neutral. They are not into politics. They don't want to say anything. Who is good? Who is bad?
But here you have these 2 characters in this village, and you can understand that one of them is more keen to go to one side, and the other one is more close to the other side. Or is that like that, or is it my perspective?
Well, it looks like that. But if you think that actually the one who is more pro-Russian, his garden faces separatists.
Yeah, exactly.
So separatists are more close to him than physically than Ukrainians. And Sergei, the main character, the beekeeper, his garden is facing Ukrainian army positions.
Okay.
And in fact, when the war started, and we had a huge number of refugees from Donbass, so many people who lived more close to Russia, they went to Russia, and those who lived more close to central Ukraine, they went to Ukraine. So I mean, they were not going there because they were pro-Russians or pro-Ukrainians, because they wanted the shortest way out of this war. And so, but when you, because of this, go to Ukraine, and you are well treated, and you become pro-Ukrainian. If you go to Russia, and then you are sent to be resettled in Kamchatka, 7,000 kilometers away, where you will never earn enough money to buy a plane ticket to go back.
You also become pro-Ukrainian.
Well, you can become pro-Ukrainian, or you can become a fatalist, because fatalism is a Russian thing. Yes. I mean, Ukrainians are not fatalists. They are maybe sometimes crazy optimists on the, almost on the border with psychiatrical disease. Because I just want
that explains a lot.
Yes, but there was a wonderful new joke, because Ukrainians answer the danger with jokes always.
Yeah.
And humor helps to survive. That's true. But one of the latest jokes in internet, I think it's very typical. It shows the character that Ukrainian is asked if he is ready for the nuclear end of the war. And the Ukrainian answers, "Yes, I am ready, and I have plans for 6 months afterwards." Yeah, but I should say that I met many refugees who went to Europe from Ukraine, and in many cases I noticed that they were not fatalistic, but they lost sense of humor, because I mean, if you lose your house, if you lose your home, you don't think that you will return to the village. You become you lose your Ukrainian identity, in the sense that the optimism is not there.
But do you think it's easier to stay optimist while you're in Ukraine, even though you left your house and you're now living in some different place, or to come to Europe? You think how it works? How does it work?
I mean, in general, I think if you talk about psychology of refugees, it depends on the circumstances when person leaves house behind. Because I mean, I met people from women, because I mean, we should understand that most of the refugees are women and children. The men, if they are not older than 61, they cannot leave the country. Yeah. They are either fighting or they are in their houses, so they are housekeepers. But generally, I mean, like this family I met from Drushkovka, I mean, they were sure. Well, I mean, maybe they changed their mind, but I think they were sure that they will not go back.
That's Donbass, right?
Yeah, Donbass is near Donetsk, and actually, and this is the territory which is in ruins. Mm-hmm. And to rebuild it, I mean, probably we will need 15 years' time and hundreds of billions of euros. So I think the refugees who go to Europe from Donbass, they are unlikely to come back. Mm-hmm. The refugees from the other regions of Ukraine, probably they will come back. Because, I mean, first of all, they want to be back with their husbands and brothers, etc. And Ukrainians are very attached to Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Because, I mean, it's a wonderful country with the biggest mushrooms. And actually now the mushrooms, I mean, the Ukrainians are now posting on Facebook news from the front line and the photos with the mushrooms. And some mushrooms are like 1 or 2 kilos.
Sometimes they also joke that those mushrooms come from Chernobyl, you know?
Maybe. There were many jokes, yes, about mushrooms from Chernobyl.
That was... once my boyfriend came to meet my parents. I'm from Ukraine, so my parents are Ukrainian, and they had some mushrooms, and my boyfriend ate those mushrooms, and then my father told him, "Good, right? From Chernobyl." So it's still a joke, even here in Portugal. But coming back to this book, it's really hard to explain a war. Right? Because obviously you have the fighting, you have people crying, houses, buildings destroyed, but it's not only that, right? And I think when you read this book, you can understand a little bit what lies between the lines, right? Like the silence that is not silent because you are used to hearing all the bombing and all those things. How can you also explain? Can you explain even? I'm sorry. It's really hard to explain exactly what a war is. And my question is, could you describe this war in another way than is in this book?
Well, I mean, if I would have written about fighting and the armies marching, etc., it would be a book about any war.
Yes.
Yeah, but I mean, this situation is special, and especially, I mean, the events. I mean, here I thought I was describing events of 2017. So this frozen war, but every day some people killed, some people wounded. The artillery fire is used in different places on the front line, etc. But the main thing is that. The war changes psychology of people. I mean, it makes some people more brutal, more radicalized. Some people turn from extrovert into introverts. So, I mean, one of the first victims of the war is trust. you don't trust anybody. And in general, actually, war is a trauma that remains for 2 generations after the war is over on the territory where the war was fought. So, I mean, all Ukrainian society is traumatized in this or that way. The veterans, when they come back home, I mean, half of them will need psychological treatment and they will not get it. And they will carry the war with themselves until the last day of life.
And passed that.
We had it already, actually. And it's interesting because the impact of veterans on Ukrainian society before the beginning of new phase of the war was very positive. I mean, from 2014 till February 22, more than 400,000 Ukrainian men went through the front lines, through the fighting in Donbass.
Young men.
And when they came back, I mean, they created a community, radical community in the sense that for them, justice is more important than the law. Many of them started businesses, and in this, of course, I mean, any business in a country like Ukraine is connected with problems, either from the state functionaries or from mafia. So they were defending actually each other from mafia and from the people who were demanding bribes. And they started, I mean, they created now the most popular chain of pizzeria, Veterano Pizza. Yeah, and I know the founders, actually, I mean, one of the founders is killed now in this war already. The second is alive and fighting. But these veterans were sure that the war is coming. And they were regularly going to the shooting range to train. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I have friends who were training with them, and they were saying that we should be ready. And when the war started, most of these veterans immediately joined as volunteers. So after this war is over, we will have maybe 1 million of men who went through the war. And what is interesting also that this community of veterans created their own literature about the war. And they set up their own publishing houses.
Wow.
And there was even Facebook conflict between traditional writers and veteran writers. I mean, it's over, of course, but they I mean, I think they participated in all in culture, in everything. Even filmmaking. I mean, the veterans were making documentary films about the war.
You right now, I've read that you are not writing anything like a novel. You stopped the one that you were writing before the war started, and you're not writing anything now. Why?
Well, I'm writing articles and essays about the war. I published now in London Diary of Invasion, the collection of my notes and articles from December last year till 15th of July, just to some kind of chronicle, but not again, it's not chronicle of the battles. Mm-hmm. It's a chronicle of human life in Ukraine during the war. It's about refugees, about lots of stories actually, because I mean, also about my family. And my family didn't protest yet, except my daughter. But I mean, it's about human aspect of the war, how it ruined the lives. Actually, I mean, 3 days ago, our friend, an old doctor from Kiev, died in Mainz, in Germany. I mean, during the war, in the beginning of the war, he was in the hospital in Kiev, on the 6th floor after amputation of his leg because of the diabetes. He was practically abandoned because among the refugees there were doctors and nurses, for example. And so suddenly in this hospital, half of the doctors were gone, but also half of the patients were gone because they were taken by their relatives and taken to the Western Ukraine. And we were trying to help him and his wife, and we were following their adventures. And they ended up, in the end, actually, they managed to get to Germany, but he needed more operations because, I mean, his wounds were open because of he was going by car with amputated legs. And now he will return on next Friday as ashes to Kyiv. He was dreaming of coming back in the spring together with his wife. He has a wonderful flat filled with antiques. He was collecting jazz records and antiques. Actually, antiques he inherited from his mother, his mother has a story. I mean, she was a German antique dealer who went probably Russian-Ukrainian origin, who went to Germany after Revolution 1917 and returned with her antiques to the Soviet Union, wow, where he was born here. And so, I mean, there are thousands of stories like this.
It's very important to share those stories.
Yes, because
with the world.
He would be alive now in Kiev if there was no war. Yes. And Russian speakers of Mariupol, ethnic Russians and ethnic Greeks, because I mean Mariupol is, has a huge Greek population. I mean, they would be alive if there was no war, and I wouldn't be here now. Probably this book would be published much later if there was not. I mean, because I mean now, since the attention to everything Ukrainian is so strong, so people are trying, and publishers are trying to publish more books by Ukrainian, about Ukraine. It is very important, but very important is also that Ukraine is not forgotten when the war is over.
You've been traveling, as you're saying, a lot in Europe this last month, and you've been talking to a lot of European journalists about everything that's happening and publishing in a lot of different publishers. Do you still feel all that support as in the beginning, or do you feel that these months have been declining in the support?
Well, what is happening, I think we have more and more military support from the European states, of course from America, and the ordinary people are very sympathetic and very supportive. But, for example, I see less Ukrainian flags in the windows now in different countries than I used to, because every time in the beginning of the war you come to London, you feel at home, because, I mean, you don't see Union Jacks, you see only Ukrainian flags. The same was in France and in Italy and in Greece. And now, actually, you are looking, you want to find the Ukrainian flag. Usually you find one somewhere, but it's not so obvious anymore. And, of course, I mean, 7 months, I mean, it's like people don't see an end to this story. They are still with Ukraine in their hearts. And I'm very happy that actually Ukraine, the war didn't disappear from the news in Germany, in France. I mean, it's every day. I mean, Frankfurter Zeitung Allgemeine, the newspaper, publishes several big articles every day about the war. So, I mean, thanks to media, people understand that the war is not over. But we have a winter ahead. And I think winter with the high energy prices will not change the attitude, but it will make people more worried about their own livelihood and life.
It's psychologically easy to explain.
Yeah. About
Crimea, in your before preface you forward, you say that you don't believe that Crimea will ever be Ukraine. Do you feel that?
I mean,
now?
I believe, because I am a writer, and I mean, I can imagine lots of things which are realistic or not realistic. I mean, I think I wrote this preface before I understood that Russian army is weak and not motivated, and actually the whole system in shambles, because I mean they are afraid to accept failure. I mean they are pretending that they are still fighting well and doing strategical retreats back to Russia or back to the border. So I mean the weaker Russia will be after the end of the war, the more chances that Crimea may return to Ukraine. But I mean, of course, I mean, in Crimea, it's only Crimean Tatars who are really Ukrainian patriots. I mean, and Russia, during the last years, 7 years, 8 years from the annexation, they brought lots of Russians who settled in Crimea. So if you organize a referendum, you will see that they will not want to go back, majority will not want to go back to Ukraine. So what to do? about this. I mean, there are lots of other issues because all the documents, all the property documents, all the contracts signed in Ukraine after annexation, according to international law, are void. I mean, they are not real, they are fake. So, I mean, logically would be to announce Crimea independent under control of United Nations, keep it like this for 20 years, sort out the legal papers. And in that time, it will depend what will happen in Russia and in Ukraine, and then to have referendum for people just to have a choice, judging from the, well, if they want freedom, they should choose the country which gives more freedom, which the answer is obvious. If they want to be monarchists and collective supporters of Russian Tsar, you will have another result, yeah.
But sometimes when people live in darkness for a long period, it's very hard to see the light, right?
Well, I mean, the notion of light disappears. I mean, they don't know what is light if they live in darkness. I mean, if you don't have any freedom, how can you compare this freedom with this freedom? And actually, I mean, the choice, I mean, when you, in the Soviet Union, I mean, this was a funny situation. I mean, you had choice not between cheese called Camembert and Dutch cheese. You had a choice between one bad cheese and one bad sausage. So, I mean, I remember that my friends who went suddenly abroad as tourists and came back, and they were paralyzed. They said that they couldn't decide, they didn't buy cheese because they couldn't decide which cheese to buy. So, I mean, you need really a lot of time to pass for a person to understand that there is a choice, that there is a freedom, and then there is a responsibility for your choice and for the use of your freedoms.
One of the consequences of this war is the whole world could see the real difference between Ukrainian mentality and Russian mentality. Do you agree?
I agree. I agree. But I mean, it comes with a very high cost.
Yes.
Because I mean, for many Europeans, all Soviet people were the same.
Yes, that's true.
And this was actually the dream of Lenin. He wanted to create a Soviet identity, which would be detached from national identity, ethnic history, etc. So, I mean, somehow he managed to do this with Russians. 90% of Russians, actually, I mean, they still have, they don't have Russian identity, they have Soviet sort of universal common identity with everybody else. And the Russian classical culture, which is also an instrument used by Putin to compensate negative political image with positive cultural image, I mean, it is not the basis for Russian identity. Because, I mean, they are not connected to this culture. Otherwise, they wouldn't kill civilians in Bucha and they wouldn't do what they did. Because, I mean, the purpose of culture to make people civilized and to teach how to behave. I had a very interesting dialogue recently in France with Andrei Markevich. It's the most famous translator of Dostoyevsky in France. And his theory is brilliant. He thinks that actually Fyodor Dostoevsky is guilty in this war.
Wow.
Because he showed that in Russia you have cult of X, you know X.
Yes.
And that Raskolnikov shouldn't be judged. He was forced by life to kill this old lady. And he was not punished. So, I mean, this fatalism when you have to kill because, I mean, this is the situation. The life forces you to be immoral and it is acceptable. And of course, I mean, nobody talks about the personal experience of Dostoevsky, who was sentenced to death and then pardoned by Tsar several hours before execution. So, I mean, the cult of Dostoevsky is the cult of X. The cult of crime without punishment.
That's why he's a favorite author of Putin?
Well, I do. I mean, Putin says different things from time to time. I'm not sure he read Dostoyevsky.
He only reads the books that he writes.
Yeah, I mean, he read Dugin. He read this chauvinist ideologist who, during the pandemic, because he had nothing else to do, and he believes that Russians are sort of superior nation to everybody else because they are more spiritual, more moral, because the West brings homosexuality and decadency and everything else, and Russians are the only real people who will save the humanity, yes. But I mean, yeah, I mean, it's like saving humanity the Dostoyevsky's way.
But why is he so obsessed with Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian
Well, I mean,
existence?
if you notice, actually, he was defending Stalin in the first 10 years of his presidency. And then the first private monuments to Stalin were erected in Siberia and in other places. Then he started saying that his favorite historical Russian figure is Ivan the Terrible, who was famous for torturing the people and killing people, which probably showed that he has KGB background. But then, actually, recently he started saying that he likes Peter the Great, and Peter the Great was the main Tsar in Russian history, which is a bit contradictory because Peter the Great was opening Russia to the West and not closing it from the West like he's doing. But actually then I understood why he likes Peter the Great, because in 2009 there was a famous Poltava battle in Ukraine between Russian army with Peter the Great and Ukrainian army led by Hetman Mazepa and supported by Swedish army of King Karl XII. And Russian army beat the Ukrainians. Ukrainians escaped to Bessarabia, and Ukraine was again occupied or taken over by Russian Empire. And after this, of course, Mazepa was considered traitor in Russia because he had treaty with Russian Tsar, and he was even a landowner in Russia, but he wanted still to fight for independent Ukraine. But what was the next step of Peter the Great? He issued the first decree in history banning publication of religious books in Ukrainian language. So he understood that he should de-Ukrainianize Ukraine in order to have a loyal province. And after that, actually, there were 40 decrees limiting or banning Ukrainian language. And actually, Ukrainian identity was, I probably said this already, was fought with the means of Russification policy. So Peter the Great is the Tsar who won one of the first wars with Ukraine. And that's why he is now favorite Tsar of Putin. And so for Putin, this war is Poltava, a new Poltava battle.
So we have...
But instead of Swedes are also supporting Ukraine, but now it is supported by NATO countries, so it's more difficult.
Let's hope that the ending is not the same.
I hope. Well, I mean, Bessarabia still, I mean, belongs to Ukraine now, mostly. So that's a region.
It won't be the same. If you could choose a name, I don't know, maybe it's not a very good exercise, but you have Peter the Great, you have Ivan the Terrible. Putin what?
Putin the Awful.
The Awful.
Oh, the Horrible.
Putin the Horrible.
Yes.
One last question. Why...
Putin the Grey.
The Grey! Putin the Grey, you should note that. It will be in history books in the future. Why bees? Why did you decide to give a grey character yellow and black animals?
Well, actually, I mean, first of all, I mean, Sergei, the main character, is typical representative of Donbass. He is not educated, he is hardworking. He was hardworking as a safety instructor, inspector in the mines. He knows what is good, what is bad from basic sort of upbringing. And at the same time, he is a kind person. He is a normal person. And in Ukraine, of course, I mean, beekeeping is very popular, and in Donbass it was even more popular. And beekeepers are considered wise men. So, I mean, they are never aggressive. They are usually, they are not drunkards. They are normal people who can give advice. So, I mean, like in our village in the Zhytomyr region, I mean, we have, on each street, we have one beekeeper. And actually, and people respect them. Because, of course, honey has medical qualities. And in Sergei's case, because he's from Donbass, he's, of course, slightly nostalgic about Soviet Union. And critical about the Soviet Union in the sense that it collapsed. It collapsed because of bad management. And he thinks that the bees are the only living creatures who managed to create communist society. Because they work hard, they produce honey, honey is taken away from them, they are not paid, but they continue to work and they are happy. And this was actually like people in Donbass were working. I mean, they were underpaid. They were producing coal, everything was taken away from them in the Soviet time and in post-Soviet time, and they never complained. And they were always voting for the local party created for them by local oligarchs.
The queen.
No, what do you mean the queen? The queen, the bee queen.
Yes, like the oligarchs for them, no?
I don't know, I wouldn't be so critical of bee queen.
Thank you.